All right, believe it or not, Dan, Bernie Sanders is not one of my top follows on Twitter.
No?
But he got into my orbit yesterday. I carefully curate my Twitter following because that's what, free people do. If someone says something that you don't like, you just don't follow them. That's why I don't follow you.
Exactly.
I'm teasing. But
I follow you, Torrey.
But Bernie Sanders is in a little bit of hot water because he's actually withdrawing a piece of legislation that has been a pretty big deal. I mean, it's a pretty big deal for me. It's a pretty big deal for a lot of libertarians. And I thought there was a time that Democrats were kind of on board with this, and it had to do with war powers. What the government does when it comes to declaring war and military actions and basically defining the scope of, the executive power when it comes to the war powers resolutions. Well, Bernie Sanders was going to put it before the Senate and then decided to pull it back because the White House isn't happy about it. And it all centers on a conflict that's been happening in Yemen. So I know it's not a sexy conflict, but it's been going on, and the United States is very involved.
To be clear, we are involved, but we do not have boots on the ground in Yemen right now. We don't have soldiers in the field.
We're very involved. We've picked a side.
Yeah, we picked the Saudi Arabian side because they're our ally and Iran is not.
Yeah. So anyway, joining us to discuss this along with other issues is Spike Cohen. You may recognize his name. He actually was the vice presidential candidate in 2020. Was that right, Spike? It's been a minute. Thanks for joining us, Spike.
Yes, 2020, yeah.
2020.
Long ago.
Great year. Wow.
15 years ago in 2020.
So Spike, can you just break it down for our audience, just kind of catch our audience up? What's going on with this war powers resolution, and why is it such a big deal, especially in libertarian circles?
Well, let's start with why it's a big deal, and I think it should be a big deal in the circles of anyone who doesn't like the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent people. A disproportionately high number of them are children under the age of 5 years old. Let's be clear, this is not a war in Yemen. It was a genocide. Over 500,000 confirmed civilian deaths, which have been carried out under U.S. Sponsoring with the U.S. weapons from the United States government, carried out by the Saudi Crown and Al-Qaeda. Now, if any of us listening to this were to give a plum nickel to Al-Qaeda, we would go to prison on federal charges of supporting terrorism. But when our government robs us to give tens, hundreds of millions, or even billions of dollars worth of weapon systems and ammunitions to that very same Al-Qaeda explicitly to carry out a genocide against the Yemeni people, that's apparently perfectly fine.
Okay, so what is the U.S.'s strategic interest here? Because we've had 3 presidents now who've done the same thing on this issue.
That's correct. Yeah, so the strategic interest, if you can call it that, is the same muddled mess it has always been. We have to keep the Saudis happy, and or I say we, the U.S. government has to keep the Saudis happy, and the Saudis are not happy with the Houthi government that has taken over in Yemen. And because the Houthis are aligned with the Iranian government. And so the Saudi government wanted help to remove the Houthis. Well, very early on into the conflict, it was very clear they were not going to remove the Houthis. And so it just became an attrition warfare where the main targets were not military. They were bridges, they were hospitals, they were medical facilities, they were medication plants, they were farms and milk factories, and everything you need to have a civil society, which is why the disproportionate harm has been against civilians. But that has been the case under the Bush administration, under the Trump administration, and now under the Biden administration. Bernie Sanders sought a war powers resolution that would effectively end U.S. involvement by not allowing them to continue to fund Al-Qaeda and Saudi Arabia. And long story short, Biden and McConnell and the Democrat and Republican establishment killed it. I know everyone listening to this is utterly shocked to discover that Bernie Sanders, who twice now has encouraged us all to fight against the DNC establishment, was then railroaded by the DNC establishment and then immediately supported and called for everyone to support the DNC establishment, that he would cave like this. I'm as shocked as you are. But that's the reality of what we're facing right now.
Yeah, and it does have pretty interesting implications. And I think for most everyday Americans, right, they kind of look at this and they say, foreign policy, yawn, Yemen, don't care. But I do think that there is a discussion to be had about how the United States has been involved. I mean, how would this situation, for example, compare to the United States involvement with Ukraine, right, in providing support in that conflict?
The difference is there that, at least ostensibly, the support has been against people who are defending their homeland. This is the literal opposite. This would be like if the United States government saw that the Putin government and the Wagner group or some terrorist group were engaging in even more brutal campaign against the civilian infrastructure and people of Ukraine and decided to fund it.
Okay, so what
the Saudis asked them to.
What did Bernie Sanders' war powers resolution actually say? What was the gist of it?
What it would have done was it would have effectively it would have stopped U.S. funding or support for any war there. Now to be clear,
is this specific for Yemen?
Yeah, specific to Yemen.
Okay.
And now to be clear, we are in a months-long ceasefire. Hopefully, the worst is over. But what this would have done is it would have made it clear that the U.S. was not going to be involved. That would have forced the Saudis' hands to go into negotiating, knowing that option is no longer on the table. That option is still on the table, and we can thank the Biden and McConnell wings of the Uniparty for killing this. And I'm attacking. We're going after Bernie Sanders because he knocked down his own resolution or refused to bring it up for a vote. But there have been many other people like Mike Lee and Rand Paul who have spoken extensively about this and the need to stop it, and they didn't step up either. And this is what happens in the so-called firebrands within the Republican and Democrat establishment.
Isn't it also, though, an issue about who actually has the power to do this? I mean, we do put the chief executive in charge of our foreign policy, diplomacy, and national security. Isn't this the purview of the president, and why would he want to give up that power to Bernie Sanders?
Well, it's the purview of Congress to decide whether or not we go to war.
Well, we're not at war, so why wouldn't Bernie Sanders put up a way to defund it? Because Congress can do that, but we're not declaring war.
We're not at war we are at war in all but name. I mean, if you look at what's happening there in Yemen, no, there aren't boots on the ground, but the U.S. government, the U.S. taxpayer is underwriting and paying for a war. It's just being carried out by other people, but it's all our money and weaponry that's going over there to be done. So if we say that if we say that the U.S. is involved in stopping the invasion of Ukraine, then in the exact same token, we're involved in the invasion and genocide against the Yemeni people.
I think there's a fair question, though, that Dan asked. Are there other legislative tools available to address this beyond stripping the executive branch of this power?
I mean, sure, it could be handled in an omnibus saying that the funding in the Defense Department could not go towards this. But this effectively this was the only way it was actually going to happen, because as we see in these omnibus bills, you're either supporting this whole entire multi-trillion-dollar bill or you aren't, and they'll blame you for, hating, puppies or children that need, WIC or something like that if you don't vote for it. This was an isolated, it is only about this. We are voting up or down on support for, again, Al-Qaeda. Which, again, if it was anyone but the U.S. government doing it, we'd be we'd be facing prison for supporting terrorist groups. This was an opportunity to stop it. Now, speaking to the question about the presidential purview on national security, it's Congress that is supposed to hold the purse strings on this thing. And they should be able to say, okay, fine, you can have whatever foreign policy you want. We're not going to fund genocide anymore. And they dropped the ball on it.
Well, that doesn't sound like what Bernie Sanders was trying to do, was it? Was Bernie Sanders trying to defund this, or was he just trying to move the administration's hand and tell the administration what they can and can't do?
Well, the resolution clearly is that this is not going to be supported, with the idea being that it's not going to be funded.
Okay.
I mean, ultimately, that is what it comes down to. And I would say that the biggest problems we've had, not just in foreign policy, but in every single aspect of what government does to and for us in our lives, is directly related to the fact that Congress very often has subjugated the authority they have to the executive branch, no matter which party's in charge, and given them way too much authority to presidents and regulatory agencies to use their pens and phones to determine how we live our lives without any kind of congressional oversight or an ability for us to hold our representatives accountable for it. This was a return to, or could have been a return towards Congress having more of the oversight that they should have, that actually exercising the authority they're supposed to use.
All right. That was very, very insightful there.